All right, guys, this is episode 6 of Momentum TV. We're going to be breaking down the exposure, everything that you need to understand and do to get your prospect to say yes. Financial success, today it's more about based on really having the long-term vision. So over the last couple of weeks, we've gone through our 6-step recruiting process. Remember, our whole purpose in putting these videos together is to help you recruit at least 100 new distributors within the next 100 days. The first thing we started off with was identifying prospects. From there, we went into how to peak your prospects. From there, last week, we covered how to set appointments and the things you need to do to increase your show-up ratio. Today, we're going to break down how to expose your prospect. So let's get right into it. So what is an exposure, right? Some people think that a peak is an exposure. Like, oh, I asked somebody if they wanted to make money. Does that count as an exposure? The answer is no. By definition, an exposure is when your prospect gets all the information they need to make an educated decision. So what type of information would that be? Well, it would be the compensation plan. It would be information related to your products and services. It would be testimonials of customers as well as people in your company who are having success. So all the information that is pertinent and necessary for someone to say, yes, I'm interested in doing this, or no, I'm not interested in doing this. That is what an exposure is. Now I'm going to cover something, before we get into nuts and bolts of exposure, a very important idea that we all need to understand going into every exposure, and that is we must get out of our own way. What do I mean by that? We have to realize that we have literally one opportunity to make an impactful impression on your prospect. So when it comes to getting out of your own way, what it means is in the exposure process, whether you're going to be doing in-person meetings or online meetings, these rules stay the same. And that is number one, sloppy versus sharp. Right? Do you come dressed sharp? Do you have the information ready to go? Do you have your documents printed ready to go? If it's online, are you sending them the email? And in that email, are you actually using proper English and grammar? Are you sending them the right documents and files? Sharp versus sloppy, major key. Number two, are you confident or are you insecure? How are you showing up? How are you handling yourself around the prospect? Understand that people follow people with strength, and someone can definitely tell if you are insecure, if you don't have confidence. That will be a major turnoff for your prospect. Number three, trust versus distrust. Now, are you coming across in a way that gets your prospect to trust you, or are you making your prospect uncomfortable and in fact creating distrust? Because if people don't trust you, obviously they're not going to want to do business with you. Number four, simple versus complicated. What does this mean? A lot of times, because we have experience and knowledge and we've been in the business for some time, we understand our business at a different level. Your prospect is like a baby in terms of understanding. So when we are explaining the business or exposing our prospect to the business, are we keeping it simple so they can digest the information in order to make a decision? Or are we complicating it, talking over our prospect's head, leaving our prospects dazed and confused, right? And then the fourth and final piece is connected versus disconnected. Does your prospect feel connected with you? Do they feel connected with your leadership, with your mentorship, with the business? Or do they feel disconnected, right? And really what it comes down to is people need to like you, right? If they like you, they're going to trust you. If they trust you, they'll listen to you. And once you have their ears open and their hearts open, that's going to allow you to expose them effectively. All right, so now we're going to get into the two different type of exposures. Online exposures versus offline exposures. I know it's a big debate. A lot of people ask me all the time, Max, what's better? Should I get my prospect to meet with me in person, or should I use a video? What should I do? Well, let me first define what an online exposure is versus an offline exposure. An online exposure is a video. It could be a conference of some kind, like a webinar jam or Zoom conferencing. It can be a live stream done on Facebook Live, Instagram Live, YouTube Live. So any type of exposure that is done utilizing the internet is considered online. Now, an offline exposure would be one-on-one, where you're meeting with the prospect, maybe at a Panera Bread or a Starbucks. It could be a home meeting or group meeting or a hotel event where everyone gathers at a location and we show them the business. So obviously, an online meeting is internet-based, an offline meeting is in person, right? So understanding the two differences, there are also pros and cons with both that you want to understand. So let's get into the pros and cons of both type of exposure. So pros and cons for online meetings are instant exposure. It really takes no time to get someone from, yes, I'm interested, to seeing the business, right? Unlimited reach. There's billions of people on Facebook, so that technically means you could expose billions of people. Unlimited exposure, which means that there really is no time limit, right? Because it would be digitalized or automated like a webinar or a video recording, you have the opportunity to expose unlimited amounts of people without having time be an issue. No drive time, right? That goes into time being an issue where you don't have to drive anywhere to meet your prospects. No skills required, because if it's a recorded webinar or video, technically, all we have to do is push play. So the only skill you need to have is booking an appointment and then sending the video or webinar link to your prospect. Here's one of my favorites: no uplines needed, because here's why. What I found was, for most people who focus strictly on offline recruiting and exposing, they need to wait for their upline to, be available to come do the meeting, or they need an upline that's effective. Not everybody has a leader or upline who knows what they're doing, and sometimes an upline or leader's inability to present or explain effectively can actually ruin someone's results in this business. So the fact that you can leverage a video or recorded video, that minimizes the need to have an upline involved, right? And then here's the best part: it's low cost. It's basically free to be able to expose someone to the business online. So now let's get into the cons of online exposures. Number one, distractions are everywhere. The fact that they're online or on the internet, they're being bombarded with notifications left and right. Not only that, but the information sometimes is watered down because you're creating a presentation that can basically attract all types of people. You're not really speaking specifically to that person's individual's goals and needs. So it's more of a one-size-fits-all approach rather than a specific custom-fitted conversation. Less emotional connection, because it's video or a webinar. That technology curtain is getting in the way of that human interaction, human connection. And then the worst part about an online exposure is the prospect's actually in control, because they can turn the video off, they can turn it on mute, they can get up and walk around, they can take a phone call. You can't control the dynamics of that exposure because you're not there. And your prospects can make a decision right there and then with the flick of a button to turn it off, right? Here's the other thing we found: leaders get lazy. They depend so much on the digital exposure, where instead of actually putting in the work to go meet the people and build a relationship, they just send the video and let the video do what it needs to do. And yet, that's cool, that's great, but what we found was leaders begin to use it as a crutch to actually avoid going out there and meeting and connecting with people. And here's one of the most interesting things about online exposures is that it actually scares and intimidates older demographics. People who are not internet savvy or not comfortable with technology, they actually get turned off by the business if they're being exposed through the internet. Because in their mind, they're thinking, I don't even understand how the internet works, let alone how this business works. How in the world am I going to do this? Okay, so now let's go into the pros and cons of offline meetings, okay? Let's pull that list up. So when it comes to offline meetings, the pros are it really allows you to build rapport and build trust with your prospect, because if they're right there in front of you, there is nothing that replaces someone being right in front of you where you can talk to them, you can connect with them, you can feel their energy and emotion. That is so powerful. You can't get that effect through an online exposure. You can also control the environment. When you're exposing someone, let's say at a home meeting or a Starbucks or a hotel, well, you set the time start, you set the meeting end, so that prospect can't just get up and leave. They know that they're here for a fixed amount of time, and you kind of clear the time during that presentation. As an example, here's how I would do it, let's say at a one-on-one. Hey, Mr. Prospect, I just want to find out, how much time you have. I've already set aside for about 45 minutes to go over all the information. Does that work for you? Boom, done. So for that 45-minute window, you have that prospect's undivided attention. That's something you really can't do when it's an online presentation. You can also personalize the presentation. Because they're in front of you and you're talking to them, you can get added insight about their goals, needs, and wants. So when you're presenting to them, you can weave it into the conversation so you talk specifically to their needs, right? Social dynamics. When you're in a group environment, as an example, like a hotel meeting or let's say a home meeting, if there are other people involved in the business who are also present, you can leverage the social proof aspect. You can leverage the power of other people's influence and testimonials to get your prospect to make that decision, right? And then the last piece is the fact that there is effort required for your prospect to show up to the exposure, like they have to drive to the meeting and all that. That in itself is a sort, because the people who don't show up are probably not the ones you're looking for. They're probably not that serious or committed to getting the information versus those who do show up, right? So we find that that little inconvenience is actually a positive thing because it sorts the curious from the serious. So what are some of the negatives about offline exposures? Number one, drive time. Obviously, you're going to be driving to and from meetings, and the prospect has to do the same. Also realize that the majority of meetings, unless you're really, really effective with appointment setting, that's why I did the last video, you're going to have more than likely a 30, 40, or 50% show-up ratio, which means that you'll book meetings, people flake on you, but so therefore you wasted time, right? Meeting time, the meeting itself can take 30 minutes, 1 hour, or more depending. So it does take a lot of time on your part. You literally have to time block yourself so you can't do anything else during that meeting. Whereas opposed to if it was an online meeting that was recorded, they could be watching it. While they're watching it, you could be doing something else. Skills. The negative is you need to actually have skills to present the business. If they're meeting in front of you, you need to know how to communicate. You need to know the information, the background information. You have to have a level of efficiency and effectiveness in your presentation, whereas if it was online, you may not necessarily need to be that effective and skilled. So what else? There's a duplication lag. What do I mean by that? So the fact is, if you're presenting the business and your whole business is built on you doing personal exposures, there's a learning curve involved, not just for you, but also your team. We have to realize that the majority of people that you're going to be working with in your downline will only see you present the business at certain times. They're not going to follow you to every single meeting. And if they have to depend on showing up to your in-person meetings to see you present so they can learn, well, that process slows down duplication. Whereas if it was online, it would be the same presentation on a video, pre-recorded all the time, 24/7. So in fact, your team, your reps, they have a chance to actually learn how to present a lot faster because of that duplicatable presentation you're constantly being exposed to, right? Here's another negative I found about offline presentations is that when you're presenting to a prospect, depending on what that prospect's mindset is, they're going to begin thinking that they have to start presenting too. And not just presenting, but doing a lot of presentations. And one big hurdle for a lot of people is the fear of speaking and selling and presenting. So if that prospect sees you doing it, and automatically in their mind, that's what they're going to have to do. And that can be a turnoff. And the final negative of an offline exposure is that there is a cost associated with it. Obviously, gas, driving to and from meetings. If you're at Starbucks all day, you're drinking coffee. If you're doing hotel events, you're paying for hotel, you're paying for equipment. So there's a cost associated with it, which typically means you're going to be putting out money in hopes that you're going to be able to make money by enrolling prospects into the business. So as you can see, there are pros and cons to both. So what's my suggestion? What is my personal preference when it comes to exposing people to the business? Well, I use the concept of 1-7-17. What is that all about? So most people have this idea that if I just expose the person to the presentation, they can make a decision. Well, that is how most amateurs go about the business, right? They expose them one time and want them to make a decision. Now, the rule of 7, right, is, well, prospects need to be exposed 7 times before they make a decision. And that's something I used to really, really abide by a couple years ago, making sure that we had multiple exposures lined up to ensure that our prospects they were getting the information they needed multiple times, right, to make that decision. But now, with the internet being what it is, prospects have an attention span of the size of a flea's attention span, right? And so the number has gone from 7 exposures to about 17. Prospects need to be exposed 17 times before they can make a decision. So what we want to think about is how we can leverage both. How can you leverage online strategies so you can compress time frame and deliver the exposure as quickly as possible? But how can you also use the offline power of building rapport, building trust, building personalization in that presentation and combining the two. And also leveraging the concept of rule of 7 and 17, where you're hitting that prospect with multiple opportunities to see the information. All that really does is it increases their desire, increases their interest, and ultimately increases the probability that they're gonna join your opportunity. All right, so now we're going to get into tips for the exposure, whether you're presenting online or offline, basic tips you want to have in play in order to get the best result possible. So number one, in your exposure, in your presentation, it's important that you get your prospect in yes mode immediately. So how do you get your prospect in yes mode? It's very simple. All you need to do is just ask questions. Not just any questions, but ask questions where the answer is always yes. So as an example, prospect, does it make sense? Yes. Prospect, are you with me so far? Yes. Prospect, would you agree that the economy is not doing so well? Yes. So by asking say yes questions all throughout your presentation, you are getting your prospect in yes mode. Number two, stories. Facts tell, stories sell. Now there's two components in every exposure. There's going to be the information, whereas you're explaining the compensation plan, the products and services, and then the inspiration, which comes from testimonials and stories of leaders, your upline, yourself. So you want to tell stories that your prospect can relate with. As an example, if they're a teacher, I'm probably going to tell a story of someone who's having success that is also a teacher, right? Because birds of a feather flock together, and we want to create those bridges of connection. Number three, threading. So I want you to think about your exposure is almost like a masterpiece when it's all said and done. And every word you say, every story you tell, every bit of information at the end is going to put this masterpiece together. So one thing you want to leverage in your exposure is the concept of threading, utilizing your prospect's goals, needs, wants, fears, ambitions, motivations, and desires. So as you're presenting all the way through from the stories you're telling to explaining the compensation plan to the products and services, the entire time you're threading in there, do you see how you can actually accumulate additional income to pay for college? Do you see how you'll be able to pay off that college debt? Do you see how you're going to be able to have more time to study? Do you see how? So you're basically reinforcing what that prospect wants with every bit of information you're giving. So by the time you're done explaining, you've created this masterpiece, and what they see is not just what you've created, but more importantly, they can now see how this opportunity can satisfy their goals, needs, and wants. So number four, keep it simple. We want to make sure our message is very straightforward and simple enough where someone who knows nothing about our business can totally, fully understand our business and get excited about it because of how simple we made it. We want to make our prospect feel and think that, man, I can do this. And the only way they're going to feel confident that they can do this is if you explain it in a way that shows them that this is simple. Number five. Here's a big one, right? As you're going through your exposure, your presentation, there's different parts to your company, your comp plan, your products and services. What I like to do is chunk all the pieces of the presentation and typically come up with like 4 or 5 or 6 bullet points. And so as an example, the first bullet point might be the company background. The second bullet point might be the products and services. The third bullet point might be our marketing strategy. Our fourth bullet point might be how we generate income. So what I want to do as I go through the presentation, I want to spend about 1 minute or less on each bullet point. Here's why. Because if I only have 1 minute in my mind, right, to explain this idea, I'm going to remove all the unnecessary stories, all the unnecessary information that only confuses the prospect. Remember, your prospect's going to retain less than 10% of what you're going to explain anyways. So we want them to retain the most important part of the information, which would be the main idea of each bucket or chunk that you've created in your presentation. So 1 minute per main idea. Number 6, the final piece I'm going to give you is the transition statement. So as you present the business, you're going through each part of the exposure, you're going to basically say, hey, follow me to box number 2, follow me to the next box, follow me to the services and products. That way you can keep your attention and keep them moving forward. Why? Because people are people, man. They're gonna get distracted, their ADHD kicks in, they're gonna start thinking about how hungry they are. So the way you keep them anchored in the information is by calling to their attention the next step. And we call that a transition statement. And then once the presentation is finished, at that point, now you want to begin to get into the enrollment mode, where you start getting that prospect into the Q&A, where you're asking him the questions, right? Uncovering how he feels about the information, what he likes about the information, so you can now begin to move them into the business, which we're going to cover next week on Momentum TV episode 7, where we're going to go in on enrollment and closing and getting that prospect to jump on board with your business. So guys, that is the exposure phase. Make sure you review the other videos if you haven't already seen them. Next week, we're getting into enrollment and how to actually close, what to say, how to handle objections. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so you get notification right when we drop that video next week, Monday. Hit the like button, leave a comment if you have questions. We always go back and read all the comments. And guys, we really appreciate it if you could follow us on Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook. We'll see you guys next week. Take care. And let's go beast mode. Financial success today is more about based on really having the long-term vision